David had sworn off office romance after his divorce, but Sophia Chen had a way of making all his rules seem suddenly irrelevant. David Martinez sat in his corner office, staring at the divorce papers that had been finalized just 3 months ago. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the downtown Chicago marketing firm where he'd worked for the past 5 years. At 32, he felt like he was starting over completely. His marriage had fallen apart, his confidence was shaken, and he'd made a promise to himself. No more workplace drama, no more complicated relationships, just focus on work and rebuild his life piece by piece. The coffee in his mug had gone cold while he reviewed client presentations. His team had been working extra hard lately, trying to land some big accounts that could change everything for their small but ambitious marketing company. David had thrown himself into work, staying late most nights, keeping busy so he wouldn't have time to think about how quiet his apartment felt or how empty his weekends had become. Morning meeting in 5 minutes, called out his colleague Jake from the hallway. David grabbed his notebook and headed to the conference room, expecting another routine Monday morning discussion about quarterly goals and client updates. But when he walked into that meeting room, everything changed. She was standing by the window, looking out at the busy street below. Her long black hair caught the morning light, and when she turned around, David felt something shift in his chest. She had the kind of presence that made everyone else in the room seem to fade into the background. Confident, poised, with eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet our new creative director, Sophia Chen," announced their boss, Mr. Thompson. "She's joining us from the Morrison Agency in New York, and she brings some incredible experience in digital campaigns and brand storytelling." Sophia smiled and stepped forward. "Thanks for the warm welcome. I'm excited to work with all of you and bring some fresh ideas to the table." Her voice was clear and confident, with just a hint of something playful underneath. As she spoke about her background and vision for the creative department, David found himself paying attention to more than just her words. The way she gestured when she talked, how she made eye contact with each person in the room, the small smile that played at the corners of her mouth when she mentioned shaking things up a bit. "I believe in taking risks," she continued, "in pushing boundaries and creating campaigns that people actually remember. Safe is boring, and boring doesn't sell products." David shifted in his chair. Her philosophy was the complete opposite of everything he'd been telling himself lately. He'd been playing it safe in every aspect of his life, and here was someone who seemed to thrive on the exact opposite approach. When the formal introductions were over, Thompson started assigning her to different projects. "David, since you're our senior account manager, I'd like you to work closely with Sophia on the Henderson Electronics account. They're looking for a complete rebrand, and I think your strategic mind combined with her creative vision could be exactly what we need." "Sounds perfect," Sophia said, looking directly at David. "I'm looking forward to working with you." Something about the way she said it made David's pulse quicken, though he couldn't quite figure out why. "Welcome to the team," he managed to say, keeping his voice professional and neutral. Over the next few days, David tried to maintain his usual routine. He arrived early, worked late, and kept all his interactions with the new creative director strictly business-related. But Sophia seemed to have other plans. She had a way of appearing wherever he was. If he was grabbing coffee from the break room, she'd be there too, asking his opinion on different roasting methods. When he was working late, she'd somehow still be at her desk, humming softly while she sketched out design concepts. During client calls, she'd catch his eye and raise an eyebrow when a client said something particularly ridiculous, making it hard for him to keep a straight face. "You know," she said one afternoon, appearing at his desk with 2 cups of coffee, "I noticed you always drink your coffee black. No sugar. That's pretty intense." David looked up from his computer screen, surprised. "I didn't realize anyone was paying attention to my coffee habits." "I pay attention to a lot of things," she said with that same mysterious smile, setting one of the cups on his desk. "Try this one. It's still black, but it's a different blend. I think you might like it." He took a sip, and it was actually perfect. Somehow she'd managed to find exactly the kind of coffee he preferred, even though he'd never mentioned his preferences to anyone at work. "How did you know?" he asked. Lucky guess, she said, but her eyes suggested it was anything but luck. Tew. Henderson project brought them together more often than David had anticipated. They spent hours reviewing market research, discussing target demographics, and brainstorming creative approaches. Sophia had ideas that were bold and innovative, while David focused on the practical aspects and budget considerations. They made a surprisingly good team, even though their working styles were completely different. During one late afternoon session, they were alone in the conference room, surrounded by sketches, mood boards, and coffee cups. Sophia was explaining her vision for the campaign when she leaned across the table to show him a particular design element. For a moment, she was close enough that he could smell her perfume, something light and floral that made his thoughts scatter. "What do you think?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. David forced himself to focus on the design mock-up in front of him. It's really good. Bold. The client might be nervous about taking such a big risk, but it could really set them apart from their competition. Sometimes the biggest risks lead to the biggest rewards, she said, still leaning close. Don't you think? Before David could answer, other team members started filtering back into the conference room for their next meeting. Sophia straightened up and gathered her materials, but not before giving him a look that seemed to say their conversation wasn't finished. That evening, David found himself thinking about their exchange long after he'd gotten home to his empty apartment. He'd been so focused on avoiding complications that he hadn't realized how isolated he'd become. For the first time in months, someone had made him feel genuinely engaged and alive, and that scared him more than he wanted to admit. The next morning, he arrived at work determined to keep things strictly professional. But as he waited for the elevator, Sophia appeared beside him, looking polished and confident in a way that made his resolution feel flimsy. "Good morning," she said as they stepped into the elevator together. "Morning," he replied, keeping his eyes on the floor indicator. "You." "No, David," she said as they rose toward their floor. "I think you're more interesting than you let people believe." The elevator doors opened before he could figure out how to respond to that, and she walked out ahead of him, leaving him standing there wondering what exactly she meant and why the simple observation had made his heart race. As the days went by, David realized that Sophia Chen was going to be a challenge to everything he'd told himself about keeping life simple and avoiding complications. She was smart, talented, and had a way of making even the most routine work discussions feel charged with possibility. And despite all his promises to himself about staying focused and avoiding workplace drama, he was starting to look forward to those moments when she'd appear at his desk with coffee, or when she'd catch his eye during meetings, or when they'd work late together on projects and the office would grow quiet around them. He was in trouble, and the most dangerous part was that he was starting to think he didn't mind. 2 weeks had passed since Sophia joined the team, and David was starting to realize that keeping his distance was going to be harder than he'd thought. She had this way of making every normal work interaction feel like something more. It wasn't anything obvious that anyone else would notice, but David felt it every time they were in the same room. It started with small things. She'd bring him coffee in the morning, not just any coffee, but exactly the way he liked it. "I was getting one for myself anyway," she'd say, with that slight smile, setting the cup on his desk before he could protest. He never saw her drink coffee, though. Then there were the late evenings. David had always been the type to stay after hours, working on client reports or reviewing campaign strategies. But now, whenever he'd look up from his computer at 8 or 9 at night, Sophia would still be at her desk too. The cleaning crew would be vacuuming around them, and most of the office lights would be dimmed. But there she'd be, sketching, design concepts, or reviewing creative briefs. "Don't you have anywhere else to be?" he asked her one Thursday evening, trying to sound casual as he gathered his things to leave. "Same question could be asked of you," she replied, not looking up from her work. "Besides, I do my best thinking when it's quiet." "The Henderson campaign keeping you up late?" David asked, lingering by her desk longer than he should have. She finally looked up at him then, and in the dim office lighting, her expression seemed softer somehow. "Among other things," she said quietly. "What about you? What keeps David Martinez? Working so late every night?" The way she said his full name made something flutter in his chest. Just trying to stay ahead of everything, I guess. Keep things organized. Organized, she repeated, as if she was testing how the word sounded. That's very you. David wasn't sure if that was a compliment or not, but something about her tone made him think she found his need for organization amusing rather than impressive. The real shift happened during the company retreat in Wisconsin. Every year, their firm rented a lakeside conference center for a long weekend of team building and strategic planning. David usually dreaded these events. Too much forced socializing, too many trust exercises, too much time spent pretending to enjoy activities he'd rather skip. But this year felt different from the moment they arrived. During the first team building exercise, participants were randomly assigned partners for various challenges. David wasn't surprised when he ended up paired with Sophia. Random assignments at their small company often didn't feel very random. "Looks like we're stuck together," she said, but she didn't sound disappointed about it. Their first challenge involved navigating an obstacle course while one person wore a blindfold and had to trust their partner's directions. David volunteered to go first with the blindfold. "Okay." Sophia's voice came from somewhere close to his left ear. "Step forward 3 steps. Trust me." Her voice was steady and calm, and despite the fact that he couldn't see anything, David found himself following her instructions without hesitation. When he stumbled slightly on an uneven piece of ground, her hand touched his elbow lightly to steady him. "You're doing great," she said softly. "Just a few more steps." When they switched positions and Sophia wore the blindfold, David was surprised by how naturally she trusted his guidance. She moved confidently even when she couldn't see, following his directions as if she'd known him for years instead of weeks. "Nice work, you two," called out their team leader when they finished the course. "Excellent communication and trust." David caught Sophia's eye as she pulled off the blindfold, and for a moment, neither of them looked away. There was something in her expression that made his pulse quicken, a kind of awareness that seemed to acknowledge what had just happened between them, even if it was just a simple team exercise. The evening sessions were held in the lodge's main room, with a large fireplace and comfortable seating areas. David usually positioned himself toward the back during these group discussions, preferring to observe rather than participate actively. But when Sophia chose a seat on one of the couches near the fireplace, he found himself sitting closer to the front than usual. During a discussion about company culture and communication styles, Sophia raised her hand. "I think sometimes we're too focused on avoiding risk," she said, looking around the room. "Yes, we need to be responsible to our clients, but we also need to be willing to push boundaries. The most memorable campaigns come from taking calculated chances. But there's also something to be said for reliability," countered their operations manager, Kevin. "Clients want to know they can count on us to deliver what we promise." "Absolutely," Sophia agreed. "But delivering what we promise doesn't mean it has to be boring or predictable." David found himself nodding along with her points, even though they challenged his own tendency to play things safe. After the session ended and people began filtering out to their rooms, he approached her by the fireplace. "Interesting perspective. In there," he said. "Thanks. I got the feeling not everyone agreed with me. Kevin's pretty conservative when it comes to client relationships. He's been burned a few times by campaigns that were too experimental." "What about you?" Sophia asked, settling back into the couch cushions. "Do you think playing it safe is always the best approach?" David sat down across from her, aware that the room was gradually emptying around them. "In business? Sometimes. In other areas of life?" He trailed off, not sure where he was going with that thought. "Other areas of life can be messier," Sophia said, as if she knew exactly what he was thinking. "Much messier," David agreed. They talked for another hour about everything except work. She told him about growing up in California, how she'd always been drawn to creative fields but had taken a practical approach by studying both art and business. He found himself sharing stories about Chicago, about places in the city he loved, about the small apartment he was still getting used to living in alone. "It must be an adjustment," she said when he mentioned the divorce without going into detail. "It is, but maybe some adjustments are necessary." "Maybe they are," she said quietly. When David finally looked around, they were the last two people in the lodge's main room. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the only sound was the gentle lapping of lake water outside. "I should probably head up to my room," he said, though he made no move to stand. "Probably," Sophia agreed, but she didn't move either. They sat in comfortable silence for a few more minutes, and David realized this was the most relaxed he'd felt in months, not just because of the retreat setting, but because of the person sitting across from him. Sophia had a way of making conversation feel natural and unforced, as if they'd known each other much longer than a few weeks. Finally, she stood up and stretched. "Thanks for staying to talk. I wasn't looking forward to going back to an empty room just yet." "Anytime," David said, and meant it. As they walked toward the stairs that led to the guest rooms, Sophia paused. "You know, David, I think you're more interesting than you give yourself credit for." It was similar to what she'd said in the elevator that first week, but this time it felt more personal, more deliberate. Before he could figure out how to respond, she'd said goodnight and disappeared down the hallway toward her room. David stood in the empty corridor for a moment, replaying their conversation and trying to understand why every interaction with Sophia felt charged with possibilities he wasn't sure he was ready to explore. His friend Alex had warned him about getting involved with co-workers, especially so soon after his divorce. But Alex didn't understand how different this felt. The next morning brought more team activities, but David found it harder to concentrate. During meetings, he'd catch himself watching Sophia present ideas or participate in discussions, admiring not just her creativity, but the confident way she carried herself. When she'd catch him looking, she'd give him that slight smile that seemed to suggest she knew exactly what effect she was having on him. By the time they returned to Chicago, David realized that whatever had started between them during those first weeks at the office had shifted into something he couldn't ignore. The question was whether he was brave enough to do anything about it, or if he'd keep hiding behind his determination to avoid complications. That question became harder to answer every day, especially when Sophia would appear at his desk with perfect coffee and that knowing smile, as if she could read his thoughts and was patiently waiting for him to catch up to what she already understood. 3 weeks after the retreat, David was still trying to figure out what was happening between him and Sophia. Their work relationship had become seamless. They anticipated each other's thoughts during meetings, finished each other's sentences when presenting to clients, and somehow always ended up staying late on the same nights. But underneath the professional partnership, there was something else building. Something that made every casual conversation feel loaded with meaning. The Henderson Electronics campaign had been a huge success. Their client loved the bold direction Sophia had proposed, and the campaign was already generating buzz in the industry. To celebrate, Thompson announced that the whole team would be going out for dinner and drinks at Meridian, an upscale restaurant downtown. David had planned to make a brief appearance and then head home. Social events with co-workers had always felt forced to him, especially lately. But when he saw Sophia across the restaurant laughing at something Jake was saying, he found himself lingering longer than intended. She looked different outside the office, more relaxed, more vibrant. She'd traded her usual business attire for a simple black dress and had let her hair down from its typical professional style. When she caught sight of him, she excused herself from her conversation and made her way over. "You clean up nice, Martinez," she said with a grin. "I was starting to think you only owned gray suits." "Very funny," David replied, though he couldn't help smiling. "Congratulations on Henderson. The client presentation went perfectly. We make a good team," she said, and there was something in the way she emphasized "we" that made David's chest tighten. As the evening wore on, David found himself drawn into conversations he'd normally avoid. Sophia had a way of including him, naturally, asking his opinion on things, laughing at his dry observations about their industry. When Thompson started giving a toast about teamwork and innovation, David noticed that Sophia was standing close enough that he could smell her perfume, the same light, floral scent that had distracted him during their late conference room meetings. Around 10 o'clock, people started heading home. David was getting ready to leave when Sophia appeared at his elbow. "Share a cab?" she asked. "I think we're going in the same direction." David knew they lived in completely different neighborhoods, but he heard himself saying yes anyway. In the cab. They sat closer together than necessary, their knees almost touching as they discussed the evening. "Did you see Thompson's face when Kevin suggested we play it safe on the Morrison account?" Sophia asked, laughing softly. "He looked like he'd swallowed something bitter," David replied. "I think he's starting to understand your philosophy about taking risks." "Some risks are worth it," she said, and when David looked over, she was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. When they reached her building, Sophia didn't immediately get out of the cab. Instead, she turned to face him fully. "Want to come up for coffee? I have some ideas about the Morrison account I'd love to run by you." David knew it was a thin excuse. They'd already covered everything about Morrison during their cab ride. But something about the way she asked, casual but with an undertone of invitation, made it impossible to say no. "Sure," he said, and the driver gave them both a knowing look in the rearview mirror. Sophia's apartment reflected her personality perfectly. It was stylish but not pretentious, with bold artwork on the walls and comfortable furniture that looked actually lived in. Books were stacked on various surfaces, and there were creative sketches pinned to a bulletin board near her kitchen. It felt like the home of someone who was confident in her own taste and didn't feel the need to impress anyone. "Wine instead of coffee?" she asked, already moving toward her kitchen. "I have a bottle of red that's supposed to be really good." "Wine sounds great," David said, though he was starting to feel nervous about being alone with her outside of work. For the first time, she handed him a glass and gestured toward the couch. As they settled in, Sophia curled her legs underneath her and faced him. "So tell me something I don't know about David Martinez." "What do you want to know?" "Anything real? We talk about work all the time, but I feel like I don't know much about who you are when you're not being the responsible account manager." David took a sip of wine, buying himself time to think. "I don't know if there's much difference between work David and regular David these days." "That sounds lonely," Sophia said softly. "It is," David admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. "After my marriage ended, I guess I threw myself into work because it was easier than dealing with everything else." "What happened, if you don't mind me asking?" David found himself telling her about the divorce. Not all the painful details, but enough to explain why he'd been so focused on keeping his life simple lately. Sophia listened without judgment, asking thoughtful questions and sharing her own stories about relationships that hadn't worked out. "I've never been married," she said, "but I've made my share of mistakes with people, usually by being too direct about what I want. Apparently, that scares some men." "I can't imagine you being scary," David said, and immediately realized how that sounded. Sophia raised an eyebrow. "Really? I've been told I can be pretty intimidating." "Confident, maybe, but not scary." "What about now?" she asked, and something in her tone made David look at her more carefully. She'd moved closer on the couch without him noticing, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes. "Now what?" David asked, though his voice came out rougher than intended. "Am I intimidating you now?" David's heart was beating, faster, and he was acutely aware of how close she was sitting, how the low lighting in her apartment made everything feel more intimate than it should. "Should I be intimidated?" Instead of answering, Sophia reached over and took his wine glass, setting it on the coffee table along with her own. When she turned back to face him, she was even closer than before. "I think you've been holding back," she said quietly. "At work tonight, maybe in general. And I keep wondering what would happen if you stopped." "Sophia," David started, but he didn't know how to finish the sentence. "I know this is complicated," she continued. "We work together. You're dealing with a divorce. There are a dozen reasons why this might not be a good idea." "Then why are we here?" David asked. "Because sometimes the complicated thing is also the right thing," she said. "And because I think you feel this too, whatever this is." David knew he should leave. Everything rational in his mind was telling him to thank her for the wine, call a cab and go home to his safe, uncomplicated apartment. But looking at Sophia, seeing the vulnerability underneath her usual confidence, he realized he didn't want to be rational anymore. "I do feel it," he said finally. Sophia smiled, and it was different from her usual confident grin. This smile was softer, more genuine. "So, what are we going to do about it?" Before David could overthink it, he reached over and touched her face gently, running his thumb along her cheekbone. She leaned into the touch, her eyes closing briefly. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I'm not good at this anymore. Taking chances, trusting my instincts." "You don't have to be good at it," Sophia said, opening her eyes and looking directly at him. "You just have to be willing to try." They sat like that for a moment, David's hand still cupping her face, both of them aware that they were at the edge of something that would change everything between them. David could feel his carefully constructed walls starting to crumble, and for the first time in months that didn't terrify him. "What happens tomorrow?" he asked. "At work, I mean." "Tomorrow we'll figure out," Sophia said, "but right now it's just us." And then she leaned forward and kissed him. It was soft at first, tentative, giving him time to pull away if he wanted to, but David found himself kissing her back, his free hand moving to her waist, pulling her closer. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing harder. "Was that okay?" Sophia asked, and for the first time since he'd known her, she sounded uncertain. Instead of answering with words, David kissed her again, this time with more confidence, more certainty. When they separated again, Sophia smiled that genuine smile and settled against his side, her head on his shoulder. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," she admitted. "Why didn't you?" David asked. "Because I wanted you to want it too. Really, want it. Not just get swept up in the moment. And now?" Sophia tilted her head up to look at him. "Now I think you're finally ready to stop overthinking everything." They stayed on her couch for another hour, talking and occasionally kissing, both of them aware that something fundamental had shifted between them. When David finally called a cab to go home, Sophia walked him to the door. "Are you going to regret this tomorrow?" she asked. David considered the question seriously. A month ago, the answer would have been yes. He would have spent the entire night worrying about complications and consequences, but looking at Sophia, thinking about how alive he'd felt for the past few hours, he realized his perspective had changed. "No," he said, and meant it. "Are you?" "Not a chance," she replied, standing on her toes to kiss him goodnight. As David rode home in the cab, he found himself smiling in a way he hadn't in months. For the first time since his divorce, he felt like himself again. Not the careful, guarded version he'd become, but the person who used to take chances and trust his instincts. The weeks following that night at Sophia's apartment were both the best and most complicated of David's life. They'd agreed to keep their relationship quiet at work, at least until they figured out where things were heading. But keeping their feelings hidden turned out to be much harder than either of them had expected. Every morning when David walked into the office, his eyes automatically searched for Sophia. When he found her at her desk or in a meeting, she'd give him the tiniest smile, barely noticeable to anyone else, but it was enough to make his whole day feel brighter. During team meetings, they had to be careful not to let their personal connection show through their professional interactions, though David often caught himself watching her present ideas with a pride that went beyond mere colleague appreciation. The hardest part was the casual touches that had become natural between them. At Sophia's apartment or during their dinner dates at small restaurants across town, they'd developed an easy physical intimacy, her hand on his arm when she laughed, his fingers briefly touching hers when passing documents, the way she'd lean against him when they were reviewing creative concepts on her laptop. But at work, they had to maintain careful distance, and David found himself missing those small connections more than he'd expected. "You're glowing," Jake commented one Tuesday morning, appearing at David's desk with a curious expression. "Like, actually glowing. What's going on with you lately?" "Just sleeping better, I guess," David replied, trying to sound casual while his heart rate picked up, getting into a better routine. Must be some routine, Jake said with a grin. Whatever you're doing, keep it up. You seem like a completely different person than you were a few months ago. David glanced across the office toward Sophia's desk. She was on a phone call with a client, gesturing animatedly as she spoke, completely focused on her work. But as if she sensed him looking, she turned slightly and caught his eye. The small smile she gave him made Jake's observation feel like an understatement. Their relationship was changing David in ways he hadn't anticipated. Sophia challenged him constantly, not just professionally but personally. She encouraged him to try new restaurants instead of always going to the same safe choices. She convinced him to take a weekend trip to Milwaukee to visit an art museum she'd been wanting to see. When he mentioned that he used to play guitar but had stopped after the divorce, she showed up at his apartment the next week with information about music stores where he could buy a new one. You don't have to become a different person because your marriage ended, she told him one evening as they walked through Lincoln Park. Maybe you just need to remember who you were before you started playing it so safe. What if I don't remember? David asked. Then we'll figure it out together, Sophia said, taking his hand. But I have a feeling you remember more than you think. She was right, of course. With her encouragement, David found himself rediscovering interests and parts of his personality that he'd buried during the difficult last years of his marriage. He started playing guitar again, just for 20 minutes each evening after work. He began reading books for pleasure instead of only industry publications. He even agreed to go to a comedy show with Sophia, something he would never have considered a few months earlier. But the secrecy at work was starting to wear on both of them. During a particularly long planning meeting, David had to bite his tongue when Kevin criticized one of Sophia's creative concepts, calling it too risky for a conservative client like Morrison Industries. Actually, David found himself saying, I think Sophia's approach could be exactly what Morrison needs. Their current brand feels outdated compared to their competitors. Taking some calculated risks might be the smartest thing they could do. The room went quiet for a moment. David rarely contradicted Kevin so directly, and his passionate defense of Sophia's work was more intense than his usual measured responses. Well, Kevin said slowly, if you think it's the right direction. After the meeting, Sophia caught up with David by the elevators. Thanks for backing me up in there, she said quietly. I meant every word, David replied. Your ideas deserve support. Still, she said, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. We need to be careful. People are starting to notice that you defend my work more than anyone else's. She was right. And David knew it. Their professional partnership was becoming too obvious, colored by their personal feelings in ways that could create problems for both of them. The situation became more complicated when David's friend Alex stopped by his apartment one Thursday evening, just as David was getting ready to meet Sophia for dinner. You're seeing someone, Alex announced the moment David opened the door. And don't try to deny it, you've been different for weeks. Happier, more relaxed, actually smiling during conversations. David considered lying, but Alex had known him for too long. It's complicated, he said finally. Is she married? Because that's about the only thing that would make dating complicated for a recently divorced guy. She's not married, David said, then hesitated. She works at my company. Alex's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. David, tell me you're not dating someone from your office. It's not like that, David said, though even as he said it, he realized how unconvincing it sounded. It's exactly like that, Alex replied. Do you remember what happened with Jennifer? How the whole mess started because she thought you were too friendly with that account coordinator. David's stomach tightened. His marriage had indeed fallen, apart partly due to workplace jealousy and misunderstandings, though the problems had run much deeper than that. This is different, he said. Is it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're making the same mistake all over again, just with someone new. After Alex left, David found himself questioning everything. Was he repeating old patterns? Was his attraction to Sophia just another way of avoiding dealing with his real problems? When he met her at the restaurant they'd chosen, he was quieter than usual, lost in thought. Everything okay? Sophia asked after they'd ordered their food. You seem distracted. David told her about his conversation with Alex, watching her expression carefully as he explained his friend's concerns. And what do you think? Sophia asked when he finished. I think Alex doesn't understand what we have, David said, but there was uncertainty in his voice that hadn't been there before. But you're wondering if he might be right, Sophia said. It wasn't a question. I don't know, David admitted. Maybe I am moving too fast, getting involved with someone from work when I'm still figuring out who I am after the divorce. Sophia was quiet for a long moment, stirring her wine thoughtfully. David, I care about you. More than I expected to, honestly. But I won't be someone's rebound or their way of avoiding dealing with their problems. That's not what this is, David said quickly. Isn't it? Sophia asked gently. Because it sounds like you're not sure yourself. The conversation continued through dinner, both of them trying to be honest about their feelings and concerns. By the time they said goodnight, they hadn't resolved anything, but they'd acknowledged that their relationship was reaching a point where they needed to decide whether they were serious about each other or if they were just enjoying each other's company. Over the next few days, things felt strained between them. They maintained their professional relationship at work, but the easy warmth that had developed between them felt forced. David caught himself overanalyzing every interaction, wondering if Alex was right, if he was just repeating old patterns without learning from his mistakes. The tension came to a head the following Friday, when David stayed late to finish a client report and found Sophia still at her desk at nearly 8 o'clock. Working late again? He asked, approaching her desk cautiously. Could ask you the same thing, she replied without looking up from her computer. Sophia, about what we talked about the other night. You don't have to explain anything, she said, finally meeting his eyes. I get it. You're not ready for this, and that's okay. Better to figure that out now than later. That's not what I meant, David said. But before he could continue, his phone rang. The caller ID showed his ex-wife's name. I should take this, he told Sophia, stepping away to answer. David? Jennifer's voice was tentative, uncertain. I hope it's okay that I'm calling. What's up, Jen? David asked, aware that Sophia was watching him from her desk. I've been thinking a lot lately about us, about what went wrong, and I was wondering, would you be willing to meet for coffee sometime? I think there are things we should talk about. David looked over at Sophia, who had turned back to her computer but was clearly listening to his side of the conversation. The timing felt like some kind of test from the universe, presenting him with a choice between his past and his future, at the exact moment when he was most uncertain about both. Let me think about it, he told Jennifer. I'll call you back in a few days. When he hung up, Sophia was gathering her things to leave. Your ex-wife? She asked. Yeah, David said. She wants to talk. Sophia nodded, slinging her bag over her shoulder. Maybe that's exactly what you need to do before you can figure out what you want going forward. As she walked toward the elevator, David realized that his silence in response to her comment was answer enough. The thing was, he wasn't sure he was ready. David spent the entire weekend thinking about Jennifer's phone call and the look in Sophia's eyes when she'd walked away from him Friday night. By Sunday evening, he knew he had to have that conversation with his ex-wife before he could move forward with anything else in his life. They met at a small cafe near their old neighborhood, a place they'd gone to regularly during the early years of their marriage. Jennifer looked good, rested, more confident than she had during the difficult months before their divorce. She'd cut her hair shorter and was wearing a style that was more polished than David remembered. Thanks for agreeing to meet, Jennifer said as they settled into a corner booth. I wasn't sure you would. Honestly, I wasn't sure either, David replied. But I figured we should talk. They ordered coffee and spent the first few minutes catching up on surface-level things. Her new job, his work at the marketing firm, mutual friends they'd lost touch with. But eventually, Jennifer steered the conversation toward why she'd called. I've been doing a lot of thinking since the divorce was finalized, she began, about what went wrong between us, about the mistakes I made. We both made mistakes, Jen, David said gently. Maybe, but I think I made bigger ones. I was so jealous all the time, so convinced that you were going to leave me for someone more interesting, more exciting. And instead of working on myself or talking to you about it, I just became more and more controlling. David remembered those fights, the accusations about coworkers, the way Jennifer had started questioning his every late night at the office or business dinner with clients. You weren't the only one who made mistakes, he said. I stopped trying to reassure you. I got defensive instead of understanding why you were feeling insecure. The thing is, Jennifer continued, I think I understand now that my jealousy wasn't really about you. It was about me feeling like I wasn't enough, like I wasn't interesting enough or successful enough to keep you interested. They talked for nearly 2 hours, working through issues they should have discussed years earlier. Jennifer had been in therapy since the divorce and had gained insights into patterns that had damaged their relationship. She was more self-aware than David had ever seen her, more willing to take responsibility for her part in their problems. I know this might sound crazy, Jennifer said as they were getting ready to leave, but I think we could make it work this time. We're both different people now, more mature. We understand our mistakes. Jen, David started, but she held up her hand. You don't have to give me an answer right now. Just think about it. We had something good once, something stable and comfortable. Maybe that's worth fighting for. As David drove home, he found himself genuinely considering Jennifer's proposal. Their marriage hadn't been passionate or exciting, but it had been predictable and secure. With Jennifer, he knew exactly what to expect, knew how to navigate their relationship dynamics. There would be no workplace complications, no uncertainty about where things were heading. But when he walked into his apartment and saw the guitar that Sophia had encouraged him to buy leaning against the wall, he realized that predictable and secure might not be what he wanted anymore. Monday morning at work felt different. David found himself watching Sophia during their team meeting, noticing how animated she became when discussing new creative concepts, how she challenged ideas that others accepted without question. She was everything Jennifer wasn't: unpredictable, bold, willing to take risks that might lead to failure but might also lead to something extraordinary. After the meeting, David approached her desk. Can we talk? Maybe grab lunch later? I don't think that's a good idea, Sophia said without looking up from her computer. You have some things to figure out and I don't want to complicate that process. Sophia, please. I need to explain about Friday night. There's nothing to explain, she said, finally meeting his eyes. You got a call from your ex-wife and you realized you're not as ready to move forward as you thought. It happens. That's not what happened, isn't it? Sophia asked. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're someone who gets scared whenever things get real. And I can't be in a relationship with someone who's always going to be looking over their shoulder, wondering if they made the right choice. Before David could respond, their boss Thompson appeared at Sophia's desk. Sophia, could I speak with you in my office for a moment? David watched her walk away, frustrated by the conversation's abrupt end, but also struck by her words. Was she right? Was he someone who got scared when things became real? 20 minutes later, Sophia returned to her desk looking shaken. David immediately went over to check on her. Everything okay? He asked. Thompson offered me a job, she said quietly. Senior creative director at the Hartley Group in New York. It's a huge opportunity. Bigger budget, more creative freedom, significant salary increase. David felt like the floor had shifted beneath him. Are you going to take it? I told him. I'd think about it over the weekend, Sophia said. The position starts in 3 weeks if I say yes. 3 weeks? David's voice came out sharper than he intended. Why does that matter to you? Sophia asked, her tone challenging. You're the one who can't decide what you want. That evening, David called his friend Alex, needing someone to talk through his confusing emotions. So let me get this straight, Alex said after David explained the situation. Your ex-wife wants to get back together and the woman you're currently seeing might move to New York because you can't make up your mind about what you want. It's more complicated than that, David said. No, it's not, Alex replied. It's actually pretty simple. Do you want to go back to your old life with Jennifer? Or do you want to build something new with Sophia? Because you can't have both. And you can't keep stringing them both along while you figure it out. What if I choose wrong? David asked. What, if you don't choose at all? Alex countered. Because right now that's what you're doing. You're so afraid of making a mistake that you're about to lose both of them. That night, David lay awake thinking about Alex's words. He thought about his lunch conversation with Jennifer, about the comfortable predictability she offered. Then he thought about Sophia, her laugh when he'd played guitar for her, the way she encouraged him to take risks, how alive he felt when they were together. The next day, he made his decision. He started by calling Jennifer. They met for coffee again, and he explained that while he appreciated her honesty and her willingness to work on their problems, he couldn't go backward. They'd both grown as people, but they'd grown in different directions. I hope you find someone who can give you what you're looking for, he told her, but I'm not that person anymore. Jennifer was disappointed but not surprised. I could tell by the way you talked about your work, about your life now, she said. You're different, happier maybe. I hope whoever she is, she appreciates what she has. That afternoon, David waited until most of their coworkers had left for the day, then approached Sophia's desk. She was packing up her things and he noticed she'd already started boxing up some of her personal items. Have you made your decision about New York? He asked. I have, she said, not looking at him. I'm taking the job. Don't, David said quickly. Please don't take the job. Sophia finally looked up at him. Why? Give me one good reason why I should turn down the opportunity of a lifetime to stay here. Because I'm asking you to, David said. Because I know what I want now, and it's you. Not the safe choice, not the comfortable option. You. David. Sophia started, but he held up his hand. I talked to Jennifer yesterday. I told her that chapter of my life is closed. I chose you, Sophia. I choose us, whatever that looks like. Sophia studied his face for a long moment. You're sure? Because I won't go through this again. If I stay, if we do this, I need to know you're all in. I'm all in, David said. And for the first time in months, he felt completely certain about something. I'm sorry it took me so long to figure it out, but I'm sure now. Sophia smiled then, the first genuine smile she'd given him all week. The job doesn't start for 3 weeks. I haven't actually accepted yet. So you'll stay? David asked. I'll stay, she said. But I want to negotiate a better position here first. And I want us to be honest about our relationship with Thompson and the team. No more hiding. Deal, David said, relief flooding through him. 6 months later, David and Sophia had found their balance. They'd successfully navigated the office dynamics of dating a coworker, with Thompson's blessing and the team's acceptance. Sophia had gotten a promotion and a significant raise after threatening to leave, and David had been made senior partner after landing 3 major new accounts. More importantly, David had learned to stop playing life so safely. He'd started taking the guitar lessons Sophia had suggested, had traveled with her to 3 different cities for weekend getaways, and had even joined a recreational volleyball league because she'd mentioned wanting to try new activities together. Do you ever regret it? Sophia asked one evening as they walked through Millennium Park, choosing the complicated option instead of going back to what was safe. David looked at her, thinking about how much his life had changed since she'd walked into that conference room nearly a year earlier. He thought about the risks he'd learned to take, the person he'd become when he stopped.